I'm Bill Kassel, and this is Free Expression. This program is all about conveying the Christian message from a Catholic point of view and defending the liberty which makes it possible to do that. We discuss a little-known devotional season, and we take a first-hand look at the destructive myth of sex change. Join us, sit back, and enjoy some free expression. Dissatisfaction with one's sex is not a new phenomenon. Cross-dressing is an ancient practice. The notorious Roman Emperor Nero is said to have dressed and comported himself as a woman on occasion. More commonly, I think everyone has wondered what life would have been like if they'd been born on the opposite side of that great dividing line that we call gender. Sometimes, though, a person, whether male or female, can be so unhappy with life and their lived experiences be so difficult that they become convinced God made a mistake in assigning them the sex he did. This level of despair is known clinically as gender dysphoria, and for the first time in history, advances in pharmaceutical science and reconstructive surgery seemed to promise an answer to this painful dilemma. So some people have actually tried to convert their bodies and their lives into those of the opposite sex. My guest is someone who took that desperate step. Walt Heyer made what's called the transition from man to woman, but he discovered that altering his body wasn't really the answer to his life conflicts after all. He reflects on that experience in a new book from Fidelis Publishing, Embracing God's Design, addressing the spiritual and psychological crisis behind transgender identity. He's here now. Walt, thanks very much for taking time to speak with us.
Yeah, Bill, thanks for having me on. It's really exciting to have this opportunity to talk about this really important subject.
Well, you've told your story so often by now, you're probably a little tired of repeating it. But if you would, could you give us just a thumbnail of why you took such an extreme measure?
Yeah, my grandmother, 80 years ago, a little over 80 years ago, when I was 4 years old, started cross-dressing. She made me a purple chiffon dress. So that introduction by Grandma into this arena of cross-dressing then took the next step where she told me to keep it a secret. It was our little secret. But then after about 2.5 years, my parents found out what was happening, and then my dad exploded. And then as a result of that, my dad started disciplining me with hardwood floor plank, I think, to try to beat the feminine idea out of my head. And then his adopted brothers started sexually molesting me, and all this happened before I was 8 or 9 years old. So what you had was the cross-dressing, which is emotional and psychological child abuse. And then you have the physical abuse by the father, and then you have the sexual abuse by the uncle. So this is what started and precipitated into this. And then I heard the story, or saw the newspaper in the 50s about Christine Jorgensen. Because at that time, Bill, there were no words. Nobody had any of these terminologies. In the 50s, there was Christine Jorgensen, who was said to be a transsexual, had surgery, was in the military, headlines across the nation. And then I saw that headline early in life. And once I did, I actually started identifying as Crystal West privately. I didn't go, this was just in my head. And so this was all a result of being cross-dressed by my grandmother. And then because homosexual ideology was not ever a part of it for me, and actually for 90% of the people I work with, it's never been about sexuality. It's about a broken identity. So I got married in my early 20s. I had 2 children. I had a successful career. I worked on the Apollo space missions as an associate design engineer, and then went to work for American Honda Motor Company, and was one of the people who helped craft the division called Acura. But then at this time, I was struggling with what had happened to me as a child. I never dealt with the issues of being cross-dressed and what that impact was on my life. And now, after going through that at that time, I realized this was a traumatic event, and the trauma of the events that went through really required different treatment. But I went to a gender clinic. In fact, my therapist was Dr. Paul Walker, who actually wrote the existing standards of care they called WPATH. He was the primary author of that document, and he was my therapist, and he said I had gender dysphoria. It wasn't actually in the DSM at that time, but they were using it. This was 1981, and said that, you need to go on the protocol of hormones. And so I did for 2 years, divorcing my wife, leaving my children, and having the so-called sex change surgery, and then identifying as a female for 8 years. So what I really discovered after those 8 years and started studying it at UC Santa Cruz, I took courses in psychology because I wanted to really have a better understanding of this, is that, number one, gender dysphoria is not a diagnosis. It's a symptom of something you should be looking for. So if you say they have gender dysphoria, that's not the underlying problem. In my case, gender dysphoria should have been examined as child abuse, physical, sexual, and emotional. And those issues don't involve hormones and surgery as treatment, but that's where the divide comes in. So in learning all this, Bill, I realized that, first off, the doctor who did my surgery and Dr. Walker both testified in California Superior Court in San Mateo, California, that hormones and surgery does not change your gender. Your inner morphology stays the same. So in documents by the surgeon who had done over 5,000 surgeries, and the guy who wrote the standards of care admitted that your gender doesn't change. So then I knew this was the greatest medical fraud of our time, and I needed to start speaking out. I started the website sexchangeregret.com, and by 2015, I'd had over 356,000 people come to the site. I'm on television in Canada in 2009 and had been doing media since 2009, written. Now that's my 8th book, the one you're talking about, and been around the world speaking on the subject. The fact of the matter is, there's no such thing as a transgender. No one has ever transitioned, and the issue isn't gender dysphoria. When you dig into it, you find out that it's child abuse, or it's PTSD, obsessive compulsive disorder, body dysmorphia. There's so many other underlying issues, and over 90% of the people that I've worked with, it's not an issue about sexuality or homosexuality. It's an issue about having a broken identity.
Were you able to live any kind of a normal life as a woman? Did you have a job? How did your life unfold?
Yeah, identifying as a woman, I actually worked for the Federal Deposit, FDIC banking for the federal government, and I've worked in San Francisco in the executive offices there, working on bank closures, and then eventually went to work at the post office until I began to work on my recovery from alcohol. It was during my 4th step working with a Christian psychologist in 1990. He and I were praying about what had happened throughout my life with abuse, the physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. I had forgiven everybody during this time with him. And during that time of prayer, the Lord actually came to me in a vision and looked at me and said, "You are now safe with me forever." And I realized that day in that prayer, the Lord came and redeemed my life. And I knew from that day forward, I knew the truth and I needed to speak about it. And that's when, from 1990 to this conversation today, I've been serving the Lord, explaining there's no such thing as a transgender. No one's ever transitioned, and it's not about gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is only a symptom of a problem you need to look for.
What you did, of course, was so extreme, and a lot of people have gone the same route. There are high levels of hormones and the surgery. And there are side effects of all this. I mean, aside from losing your sexual organs, I understand that there's an increased risk of breast cancer. There are urinary complications. Have you experienced any of those side effects?
Yeah, you can't escape them. it's mutilating your body. And that's why I love this book, Embracing God's Design. If we embrace God's design, we won't give somebody a knife and allow them to carve up what God created. We were made, men and women, at conception, months before we were ever born, to serve God. We were made to serve God, and they're only male and female. There isn't another third gender.
Right.
And so once we put our identity into our Lord Jesus Christ and realize that we can't change what he created in the womb, then we begin to live a healthy life, one that has purpose, one that honors and glorifies Jesus Christ.
Detransitioners, such as yourself, that's the current expression I understand, the people who have had this experience and have regretted it and have spoken out against it have largely been ignored in the media. I think you're probably the most visible person in that category, but it's hard to get this message out, isn't it?
Yeah, and when I come against that, I say, actually, there is no such thing as a detransitioner because you never transition.
Right.
And in my website, Sex Change Regret, I put in there, you can get your life back, because that's really what it's about. It's about getting your life back. And it's much more palatable for people who are wanting to get their life back to realize they don't have to change back because they never changed. And so when they realize they never changed, the trip to regaining their life is a much easier one, and it's not with all kinds of complications. So it actually helps the person to understand that they never changed. Cutting off body parts does not change your biological chemistry. It may change the way you function, because what really happens, Bill, is when you begin to change your name, you devalue who you are and as a man, and then when you go through the surgery, you actually destroy how God made you to function. So it's just more of a destruction of how you function as a man or a woman, but not a change in gender.
But if you're telling your story to someone who is confirmed in the idea that they are transgender, how do you get across to them? I mean, they've got a lot of emotion invested in that idea.
I sit across from them and say, the one thing you need to understand is you're not a transgender. You never transition, and this isn't about gender dysphoria. We're going to work together, and we're going to actually discover, here's the key line that I always use. I want to know what caused you to not like who you are. And when I get into that conversation, that opens up this whole history about what happened that caused them to not like who they are. Once we get into that conversation and we find out that they were sexually abused or emotionally abused, or maybe they had cancer as a child and they lost a leg, maybe their dad died of alcoholism, maybe there was a car accident where their brother died. There's so many different things. These are all trauma-related issues that have nothing to do with sexuality. Now, some of the people come to this realization that they want to change from the internet, and we call that internet indoctrination because they're looking at pornography or they're looking at something online. They may be looking at anime and then taking on a female identity in a gaming situation, and that can precipitate them identifying as transgender. They may not have trauma in their life, but that they found it on the internet. Or the third most common one is what we call social contagion, where kids get involved in a group at school or college or wherever. They decide to join this group of people who are identifying in a different gender. And I've actually had students tell me at school they are afraid to not identify as a transgender because if they don't identify as a transgender, they get bullied. And they will say, I really wasn't one, but I had to identify as one to not be bullied. So there's a lot of things when you begin to ask what caused you to not like who you are or to want to identify as someone you can never be. Tell me how that happened. So I go right at it, and the people actually appreciate it because it actually gives them relief.
What's the role of drag in all of this? Drag has become so visible, but it seems to me that has less to do with sex than with some kind of weird, extreme exhibitionism. How does that fit in?
Well, there's two different issues with drag. There are drag individuals who do it for entertainment purposes, and they're heterosexual men. But there's also the ones that you've seen in the libraries who do the library thing, the drag queen library hour. Those are primarily, not all, but primarily homosexual men who are attracted to young boys. That's why you see them wanting to do these teachings in libraries with kindergarten kids. They are attracted to children, and they are sexual predators and should not be allowed to be in an environment with young people. They are dangerous, and they will harm children sexually. They are sexual predators.
How have we arrived at this point where a young person can feel that kind of pressure, where drag artists are invited into libraries? I mean, that represents a social and moral change that is really profound.
Well, I started writing about this years ago, and it really kind of it was there, but it wasn't advanced. But when Obama became president of the United States, he appointed a homosexual activist as a safe school czar who was to introduce into our school systems, all of the school systems, the LGBT, homosexuality, and transgenderism. And in addition to support that, Obama had 250 LGBT activists appointed as czars in his administration. So this was to flood the whole government system, which we now see he was successful in doing.
Yeah.
And that is where it came from. Had we had someone in there that had a moral compass, this would never have happened. But we can say that Obama put the rainbow stripes on the White House and pushed it. In fact, Obama had a transgender identifying person working in the White House on staff. That's how committed he was to this. So I think there's where you can point to it. And the second thing that happened was when they changed the DSM in 2013 and took out identity disorder and replaced it with gender dysphoria. And if you look at the spike in the number of people identifying as transgender to prior to 2013, it was sort of a flat line and it was not very big. But once you see this new generation being told they have gender dysphoria, which didn't require doctors to look for a disorder. You just had to say, well, I have gender dysphoria. They didn't have gender dysphoria, but you have to say you have gender dysphoria or you cannot get hormones and have surgery. So the way that clicked was sort of like the speakeasy, getting into the room. You have to say you have gender dysphoria. You don't have to have gender dysphoria. You just have to say you have gender dysphoria. Then you can get hormones and surgery.
I guess as far as the medical establishment is concerned, all of the economic incentives are there for them to push these practices.
$404 billion business for hormones yearly. You know, it's a boondoggle. It's medical fraud. It harms everybody that it involves. People who are struggling with these identity disorders, as we point out in the book, Embracing God's Design. And I worked with Jennifer Bowen's PhD on this book. She's a former trauma therapist. She's an academic, brilliant lady. And bringing my expertise from working with thousands of individuals who once identified as transgender, and then bringing her expertise in from a clinical background and blending the two together in this book just is so powerful. Is a book that anybody who has a family member or themselves struggling, or a church, or anyone reading this book, it will open them up to the fact that there are underlying issues that need to be addressed. And if they address the underlying issues, not one person will ever need hormones or surgery.
Embracing God's Design, addressing the spiritual and psychological crisis behind transgender identity. Where can people go to purchase the book, and also where can they go to find out more about your work?
Yeah, well, you can go to Walt Heyer, WaltHeyer.com. You can go to the website embracethedesign.com. And you can go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or Fidelis Publishing. The book is available there. It is really selling. It's been selling out, actually. It's been so popular. So if you see out of stock, I think you can order it, and they'll fill the order later. So don't hesitate to jump in and get that book as soon as you have an opportunity.
Walt Heyer, thanks very much for taking time to talk about all of this. This is something that seems to have taken over our society. It dominates our media. It's something that touches all of us in one way or another. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Catholicism is known for its pious practices and liturgical seasons. There are festive times like Christmas and Easter. There are penitential periods like Lent. One lesser-known observance, in fact, I'd never heard of it until recently, is St. Michael's Lent. It has roots in the Middle Ages, and one movement working to raise its profile and promote its practices is Exodus 90. Adam Minahan handles marketing for Exodus 90, and he's here now. Adam, thanks for sharing some information about this somewhat obscure religious occasion.
Yes, it's great to be with you. It's great to talk with you.
Lay it all out for us, if you would. What is St. Michael's Lent, and how does it fit in with other Catholic devotional practices?
St. Michael's Lent is an ancient tradition of the Church, kind of like what you had brought up at the very beginning of the show here. It's practiced by St. Francis of Assisi. And St. Francis, in his wisdom, realized that, throughout the liturgical seasons, it kind of ebbs and flows of fasts and feasts. And I think we can all relate to how we become pretty disciplined in ascetic practices and in prayer throughout Lenten time. And then we hit the crescendo, the pinnacle of Easter, and we're the Alleluia people, and we get into feasts, and we're celebrating and rejoicing. And then the summer months kind of hit, and if you're like me, I have multiple children, and we're running here and there, and your prayer time can easily slip from 30 minutes down to 20 minutes, down to 15 minutes, and we have the tendency to lose maybe some of our spiritual practices and routines that we had built up throughout the Lenten season. And so St. Francis of Assisi kind of felt this, and he had a deep love for St. Michael the Archangel. And so on August 15th of 1224, he took some of his companions up to a mountain and offered up the next 40 days in prayer and sacrifice in honor of St. Michael the Archangel. And so it started on August 15th, and it goes all the way through September 29th, which is the feast of St. Michael the Archangel.
Oh, so that explains the identification with St. Michael.
Yeah, and in fact, it was actually during this time period that St. Francis of Assisi received his stigmata, which we all know from seeing images of St. Francis of Assisi.
Well, what happens? What's going on during this period? Are there special disciplines and practices? Explain it, if you would.
There are things that we are trying to bring back. So like, as I mentioned, the importance of prayer, everything should be rooted in prayer, right? So it's a desire for, especially men, is who we cater to and focus on, is finding a deeper love and freedom in Jesus Christ. And so we start off and build on the foundation of prayer, specifically silent prayer. Every day throughout St. Michael's Lent, we start off the day in 30 minutes of silent prayer. And then we also have different ascetic practices that we take up that really help and cater to quieting our senses and the noise of the world, so that way we can be more in tune with what God is calling us to, that we can hear his voice throughout the day while we hopefully pray without ceasing, as St. Paul talks about. So that includes not using social media, limiting the news intakes that you have, and then accompanying that with Wednesday and Friday fast. And then one of the key disciplines, I would say, that St. Michael's Lent offers, that we offer through Exodus 90, and we started this actually last year, was a night vigil. Now, We weren't sure exactly how this was going to be received, Bill, whenever we proposed this idea of a night vigil. What do you mean? You get up in the middle of the night and pray? Like, that seems a little extreme maybe to some people. But really, we're trying to imitate our Lord by these night vigils. So we asked on Friday at 2 a.m. that men get up in the middle of the night and offer up a prayer for an hour to practice kind of spiritual watchfulness, to unite in the church's unceasing prayer across different time zones and across different even centuries, and then basically make it a sacrificial offering, giving God the hours that are kind of some of the most important, or the ones that we desire for comfort and rest while most of the world is asleep.
How'd you get onto this? What is Exodus 90 all about, and how did this whole business come to be?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. Our founder and CEO, Jamie Baxter, he was in seminary at the time, and he and a couple guys got together with a priest and formator who suggested that we try to incorporate liturgical living and keeping prayer and ascetic practices at the forefront of their thought. And really what ended up happening was, throughout that process, they built up an order of life in which it reflects upon what the church teaches in the liturgical year, and then in conjunction with the ebb and flow of what life brings about for everyday man. It started out with just 90 days preparing for Easter, and then as we kept going, we realized, the Christian life isn't just 90 days long. It's a way of life. It's a way in which you lay down your life for others, and so what does that look like throughout the whole year? So we kind of built out this whole plan of life for a Catholic man and how to live.
Well, where can people find out more about St. Michael's Lent and also Exodus 90?
They can go to exodus90.com. They can download the Exodus 90 app for a 14 days free trial. Like I said, St. Michael's Lent starts August 15th, and it runs through September 29th. So even if you're hearing this past August 15th, it's not too late to join. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and join us in prayer and sacrifice for the good of the church, the good of our families, and for the desire to pursue the art of holiness.
Adam Minahan, Exodus 90, St. Michael's Lent. It sounds like a very engaging and worthwhile spiritual endeavor. I applaud you for getting behind this thing and bringing it to light.
Absolutely. It's been a lot of fun. I appreciate it very much.
Be with us next time when we explore other aspects of religious communication and look deeper into the great Christian heritage of free expression. Free Expression with Bill Kassel is a production of Good Shepherd Catholic Radio and Company Publications, where good books, good music, and good radio are always good company. Dan Curris provided technical assistance. Theme and incidental music are by Dan Adam. The program was produced and directed by Bill Kassel. This is Good Shepherd Catholic Radio.